Nynne, I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you. So I would like to welcome you to my talk, make it very cool, the story of how the model view controller pattern was developed. And I think the key word here is story, because I'll be talking much more about kind of how it came about and thoughts about very kind of like overarching thoughts and questions about patterns and architectural questions, more than going in depth and showing you slides with code on it. So first, a little bit about myself. I live here in Copenhagen, and I've been an active member in a bunch of communities, and some of them you'll see here. So I'm very much like a community person. I think that's why I was really happy to be invited to this conference, because although I haven't been very active with Django or even work with it very much, I really kind of love the community that you have, and I really think it's really attractive for me to like be friends with you, and I really kind of it makes me want to go to this conference, and it makes me want to see all the things I can learn. And already, like the couple of talks I saw today, I learned so much that is like directly applicable for me. But yeah, so I've been a member of these communities, and some of them have been about getting newcomers into the field of programming, very much with a sort of a bent on people who are not so much represented already. So I could name like some of the communities are about getting more women and non-binary people interested in coding and motivated to stay in the field. And one of them is called Hack Your Future, which is a coding school where they teach refugees and migrants to Denmark to learn how to code, which is a nonprofit organization that is entirely reliant on getting money to run, because it doesn't charge the people who come and learn. And that actually kind of maybe led to the job I currently have. I work as a React developer for a company called Grand Compass. And this is a platform for the private foundations in Denmark that help them run. And it's these foundations that fund NGOs, nonprofits, and culture and the arts and sustainability and many other really good things. So that's been sort of a really great fit with all these other things I've been doing for a couple of years in my spare time. So I'll organize my talk around a couple of questions today. And those questions are, what are the design patterns? What is the MVC pattern? How did it come about? Where do we go from here? And those are all enormously big questions. And my talk is slotted for 25 minutes. So I'm going to loosely kind of organize these thoughts that I had for this talk around these questions, but I'll in no way like, cover everything there is to cover on these topics. Before we dive into talking about the model view controller, I thought it would be nice to just briefly talk about what design patterns are, because this is not something that, I mean, maybe some of you, but it's not something I think about every day as a developer. So I thought it was like helpful to kind of just cover that. I can tell you what it's not. Software design patterns should not be confused with software pattern design, which you see this image is showing an example of. So that's like software that helps you, for example, make a yellow shirt. So that's the wrong Google search. So I got really excited when I stumbled over, like I did in my research for this, I stumbled over this book from 2004, and it's a primer on design patterns in software architecture. And I have to admit that I really liked this super cheesy cover and this amazing aesthetic, and I was feeling very inspired by it. So as a matter of fact, I sort of like took this like early 2000s mean girl aesthetic and applied it to my entire talk. So because I thought, like, first of all, because actually I started reading this book and I kind of really liked it. And then secondly, also because I think that one thing I came across was that there's sort of been a heyday for talking about the MVC pattern, and that is exactly this period of time where it was like very, very much a big thing. So, and yeah, I just think it's lovely. It's clearly before O'Reilly started with their cool animal covers, which I also love, but this is just, it has some qualities, I think. This book does feel quite dated because it's about Java, and yeah, because of a lot of things happened since 2004. But I was attracted to it because it has these delightfully kitschy illustrations, and also it's made by 2 men and 2 women, and most of the illustrations have women on it, and it just has a lot of like really wacky cartoons, and it's overall, I'm telling you, it's a good book. So here the female protagonist of one of the chapters finds herself asking, wouldn't it be dreamy if there were a way to build software so that when we need to change it, we could do so with the least possible impact on the existing code? We could spend less time reworking code and more time making the program do cooler things. And these are actually questions that bring us closer to the definition of software design patterns, I think. So in software engineering, a software design pattern, you can say it's a general, reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem with a given context. Software design. It is not a finished design that can be transformed directly into source or machine code. Rather, it's a description or a template for how to solve a problem that can be used in many different situations. And finally, design patterns are formalized best practices that the programmer can use to solve common problems when designing an application or a system. So what is the MVC pattern and how did it come about? Yeah, so these are like, I would say these are the 2 questions that I chose to organize my thoughts about this talk loosely around. Before I go into the MVC, I think I wanted to just clear up a few things. So my background is actually in Rails, and that's how I was introduced to and have worked with the model view controller pattern exclusively. It's through Rails applications. And I am aware that Django has something called the model view template, MVT, which is slightly different than the MVC. In fact, the main difference between these 2 patterns is that Django itself takes care of the controller part and then leaving us with the template. And the template is an HTML file that's mixed with Django template language. So I'm aware. But as I said in the beginning, I'm really happy to mix up the communities, and I'm happy you want to have me. And yeah, this is a still from a very important YouTube video called Ruby on Rails versus Django. And if you haven't seen it, you really need to. And if I had enough time, I would play it for you. But it's basically about beef between Rails and Django communities. But I think it's time we put that past us. So back to MVC. So Once upon a time, in the 1970s to be precise, mixing responsibilities was the common practice, and people were still trying to discover how to do it better. So try to imagine that you had these complex systems where code was just mixed and matched and all jumbled up together. As the application complexity grew, making changes to the UI would inevitably imply changes to the business logic as well, increasing the complexity of the changes, the time spent to do those changes, and the likelihood of bugs, because there would be so much more code that you needed to change. So the MVC came into play to solve these problems by promoting a separation of concerns between front-end and back-end. And I think this separation of concern is like a sort of a key concept here, and something that I keep kind of coming back to when I look at why the MVC pattern was so popularized and what people love so much about it. So I think like the way that I was introduced to it as like early career developer was sort of like through these like myriads of graphics. That's like what I remember the most. And they all roughly kind of like show the same thing. You have the model, and the model defines what data the app should contain. If the state of this data changes, then the model will usually notify the view, so the display can change as needed. And sometimes the controller, if different logic is needed to control the updated view. You have the view. This defines how the app's data should be displayed. And finally, you have the controller that contains logic that updates the model, but it can also view in response to input from the user of the app. So if I should sum up what in my mind makes the MVC pattern what it is, you could say it's a pattern in software design commonly used to implement user interfaces, data, and controller logic. It emphasizes a separation between the software's business logic and display. And this separation of concerns provide for a better division of labor and provides improved maintenance. So again, it's like, I think it's very much this kind of the separation of concerns that is one of the biggest things. And I think it's been really interesting for me to kind of, in order to do this talk, to kind of think a little bit deeper about this, because it's only very recently that I started thinking about these qualities, because I moved away from Rails, which was what I'd spent like until last year, spent all of my career working on. So the MVC was invented in the 1970s by a couple of people. And I was really fascinated to find out that its invention is sort of tangled up in this product that I found really delightful. It's called Dynabook, and it's a mini computer that was, like, sadly, it was never really mass produced, but it was sort of like invented as like it looks like a little iPad, and it was meant as a lightweight computer for children. And it was invented by someone named Alan Kay, and he was working on this with a group of other people in Xerox Park. And at the same time, like they were kind of working on this with this idea to build these mini computers for children that were lightweight. And then the software part of that was like they were also alongside that developing this language called Smalltalk. And Dynabook unfortunately never took off because they look incredibly cute, like maybe like a nicer version of an iPad. But the software component of this research did go on to have a life of its own, and became the language Smalltalk. And Smalltalk was the first kind of language to introduce the model view controller in some way or form. So when I started looking into the story of the model view controller, I had to kind of like separate all these different think pieces where people either praise or talk trash about the pattern or patterns in general, and then also sort of the story of how it came about. And I was interested in both, I guess. So Martin Fowler, he called the MVC one of the most ill-understood patterns in the software world. And I think that was kind of interesting to hear that. And it became clear to me why he would say that when I looked into the story. Why was it so ill-understood? Could it be because the first paper that introduced it called it Thing Model View Editor, which is like an incredibly confusing title for something, Thing. So they did publish like a second paper where they cleared it up and introduced the controller like very fast after that, but like still this is super confusing. Another reason for this confusion could be that the pattern has actually had a lot of different reincarnations and has had so many changes over time. And what we see here is from 1979, model view controller, where the model represents the business logic, the view represents a widget in the UI, so like button and text box, etc. The controller provides for coordination between the view and the model. And this means that it decides what views to show and with what data, and translates user actions into business logic. Then in 1996, something called model view presenter appeared that you see right here. The idea was to further isolate the model from the UI concerns. The view is passive and unaware of the model. There's a focus on thin controllers that contain no business logic and simply invokes commands or queries in the model, passing raw data to the view. A change in the data does not trigger an update in view directly. It always goes through the presenter. And there's a single presenter for each view. So after this, there came something called model view model. After this came something called model view adapter, and so many more. At some point, like I wanted to kind of go through the iterations of this, and at some point I had to kind of stop and dial back for a minute, because I think this really kind of, it became clear that like, okay, the model view controller has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people at a lot of different times. And that's maybe one of the biggest takeaways from doing this talk. And it also kind of made me feel a little, it kind of validated like this confusion I've always had about it. The title I chose for this talk is sort of like tongue-in-cheek, make it very cool. But it's also, I chose the title because without kind of knowing why, I always really appreciated it, but I didn't know why I appreciated it. When I was doing, when I was working on the talk, I asked a lot of my friends what they thought about the model view controller and software design patterns in general. And I think like 50-50, like half of them said, I don't know anything about that. And that makes me feel like I'm a dumb programmer. And then the other half of the people I asked said, oh, I don't like that. And started explaining why they don't. And I think a lot of it kind of like boiled down to this sort of the prestige of kind of like, I think like a lot of people basically have been bullied in job interviews where they are asked to kind of know all these different patterns and like some sort of like showboating around this topic. So I think like I was unraveling when I did this presentation. I was unraveling. Like I'm not the only one who has like this feeling of being confused about it. First of all, it's confusing, and second of all, it has evolved over time, and there's been so many stakeholders pushing it in different directions. So where to go from here? What's the current state of the model view controller, and where is it now? Yeah, as I said, like I think like a part of my understanding of how people think about these things, it also came from looking at what kind of discussions there's been about design patterns. And something that came up a lot was this book that's from 1994. And it's commonly referred to as like the group of four, because it's four people wrote it. And it's sort of this Bible that has a lot of like really elaborate design patterns. It does not mention the model view controller pattern, but it's sort of something that has been something that you needed to be in the know of for a while. But because it was so ubiquitous of a book, I think it also kind of inspired like a backlash. And I found this really funny, like very, very long thread on Twitter, where someone who works for Google, he's saying like, he's just, the whole thread is just like one big rant about how much he hates this book. And here he says, "Oh, bridge, let me be absolutely clear here. Fuck the bridge pattern. It never actually solved any problems." And like, it's just like, it's an incredibly like a funny thread where he just one after one talks about how much he hates each and every pattern in the book. And I think it's been really interesting to see like all these very strong feelings people have had about it. And myself, I can say that I've been looking at it from the vantage point of having shifted to React, where it's like seemingly lifted out of this entire discourse entirely, because like most of the time it feels like React only has Vue, or it's sort of this sort of anarchistic place where there are a lot of rules that guided the MVC world have simply been set aside. So I think like if I need to kind of collect these thoughts, I would say that one thing I did learn was that these patterns and how we think of them have changed a lot over time, and that one of the friends that I talked to about it gave me like some really good ways of thinking about it, which is to think of like what goes on in our industry as being like cyclical, so that everything is a reaction to something that came before. And so you can have a moment in time where everyone wants to work on something that's very unrestricted, and where you can kind of create everything exactly as you want it. And then there'll be like a counter reaction where people want a system where there's rules and there's like there's structure, and it's like very, very like you cannot do the wrong thing. And I think and I see like the MVC pattern kind of going in and out of favor. I see that very much in this kind of story, that like the counter reaction could be like something like React, where like you can do anything you want, but you can make such a big mess if you want that. So finally, I know you were dying to know how my wonderful book from 2004 would sum up all these things. And this is one of the great illustrations. This woman, she's thinking, I guess it's a think bubble. She's thinking, remember, knowing concepts like abstraction, inheritance, and polymorphism does not make you a good object-oriented designer. A design guru thinks about how to create flexible designs that are maintainable and can cope with change. So I think these are sort of words I will leave you with, and I'll say thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have a question from myself. If if I'm allowed to ask. I've been wondering what is it called in the rates? And what just
Model view controller.
okay.
I think that's why I kept referring to it as that, even though, as you now heard, it has like 1 trillion names, because that's what I was familiarized with.
Because yeah, it's often familiar to Django people as model view template.
Yeah.
Which is like the same concept, just with a template.
Yeah.
Like you said in the beginning that you are active in a lot of communities, and I know it's also inclusive communities like our own, where we want to give people the right sort of entry points to get into our technological tools. And like, is MVC a good pedagogical method to getting people into thinking?
I thought so. I think I've actually taught it at a lot of like Rails Girls beginners workshops, where like it's over the course of a weekend. You take someone who never seen a terminal before, and then you kind of make them for things at the end, like make an entire blog application, and they're even like ending up like deploying it to Heroku, and like people are very confused by that weekend when it's over. But I've actually like tried very like specifically to teach that to a lot of beginners who are very green, and I think that it's actually good for that.
It's a suggestion to also those of you tutoring Django that this can be a really cool tool, make a very cool tool to gain an understanding before you dive headfirst into the code. I have a question more from myself. A lot of people talk about front and back end abstractions too, and does the MVC kind of land? Is it both that we should think MVC on back end and also on front end? Does it?
That was like a topic where I saw like quite a lot of think pieces, like quite a lot of Medium posts out there right now of people wanting to claim authority on this and like kind of push it in a certain direction. And one voice that I saw represented was that people are saying that there's actually more of a separation now, where like if you're a fully backend developer, that you don't have anything anymore to do with the view. So like that this kind of gets pushed further and further away if you're so I think there's so many different opinions about that, and I think it also kind of ties in together with all these discussions we have about where does front end start and where does it end, essentially.
We have any questions from the internet? The internet is silent. All right, let's give Nynne a giant applause. Thank you so much.